Welcome to another episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast. I am your host, Mark Hasera, and for over 60 years, my passion has been everything aviation. I flew KC-135s, the United States Air Force, for 24 years and loved flying airplanes all over the world. On the Lessons from the Cockpit show, we interview some of the most captivating and intense pilot, aircrew members, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. Our show investigates the tactics, techniques, and procedures these aviators created and cultivated during extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and private flying operations. But more importantly, what did they learn from these events they were in? This explanation gives our listeners practical advice on how the aviation world works and expands critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. But more importantly, folks, it gives these people an opportunity to tell their stories. Many of these stories you are hearing here for the very first time. This episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show is brought to you by Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit, found in all 4 formats on Amazon. And folks, this book has some incredible pictures in it that I took while flying missions all over the world. And you really get a behind-the-scenes look at what goes into air refueling and air campaign operations. So please go out and buy a copy of Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit to help support this show. On our show today, I got the opportunity to interview a good friend of mine that I worked with at Rockwell Collins, who is a B-52 navigator. And he told me some of the new missions that they're flying with the old B-52. It's going to keep going for a long time. He also flew some of the very first missions over Afghanistan. This is my good buddy, Chico Anderson. So, find an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's begin our discussion about the good old B-52 Stratofortress with my good friend from Rockwell Collins, Chris Anderson. Call sign Chico. Colonel Chris Anderson. Chico, how are you? Thanks for being on the Lessons from the Cockpit show today.
Hey, Sluggo, how you doing? Great. Awesome to be here. Always good to chat with you, and good to see you, brother.
You and I go back a little ways, too, working at Rockwell Collins and doing some good stuff there. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Hey, thanks. Yeah, Mark. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Anderson. I go by Chico. Mark and I do go way back. Met initially in the industry, and I'd say within probably a couple hours of meeting each other, we realized that we needed to swap some stories and talk about our very, very interesting, especially on your side, Mark, really cool experiences in the tanker and in the Air Force. So, yeah, I did 10 years active duty. When I met you, I just joined the reserves, and I've been in the reserves now. It's hard to say this, but 18 years. So 20, I hit my 28-year mark, reservist, working industry, and got to fly the B-52 for about 20 years straight as a CMR guy, not having to do any staff work or any of that. So it was a great experience, bounced around a little bit here and there, and then now I live in Omaha. And my last few years as a reservist did STRATCOM, and now I'm down at AFSOC at Hurlburt over the last year and a half.
What do you do at AFSOC?
So I'm at AFSOC, has an operations center, and it's kind of like an AOC for all the listeners, like an air operations center. That's what it started as. But as it evolved over the last few years, the AFSOC doesn't have a numbered Air Force. So a lot of those functions that are embedded usually in a numbered Air Force fall within the organization that I'm in. When I'm in the seat, when the active duty guy leaves town, he calls the reservist, and I take the seat and basically don't make any big decisions. And let him take a little leave here and there. But it's a very unique mission. It's awesome. AFSOC is fighting somewhere tonight, all over the globe, actually, especially in South America, North Africa, and still in the Middle East. So very busy, cool mission set. Never thought as a bomber guy I'd get to be exposed to that, but it's been awesome.
Oh, yeah. And the B-52 for 20 years, holy smokes. And you've seen lots of changes in the way that the B-52 operates from the old Cold War days of being on alert, flying close air support and all those kinds of things. Hey, where were you on 9/11? What were you doing on 9/11?
Great question. I was actually at Barksdale on the ramp with, let's see, in my jet, we had 20 Alcoms loaded on the airplane, real Alcoms, air-launched cruise missiles, nuclear weapons, so 6 on each wing, 8 in the bay. So we had 20. We were part of a Global Guardian, which is actually a STRATCOM exercise. Just coincidentally, it was 9/11. That was the day that the exercise team in STRATCOM had decided months ago before that would be the day they would bring the K word. Can I say, the horn, the klaxon?
Yeah.
Say that. Everybody, any guys that are listening might be running for the exit.
Yeah.
It's interesting. They planned out at 9:12 a.m. They planned this exercise out, almost a year before. They said at 9:12 a.m. on September 11th, because it makes sense. That's going to be the end of the exercise. That's when we will ring the klaxon and everybody from STRATCOM will observe the crews respond to the airplanes, the timing it takes, read the message, decode, etc. Well, that morning, everything kind of was dynamic, obviously. At 9:12, when the klaxon went off, that's actually when the second tower got hit. So I was on the ramp with a bunch of other, a certain number of other airplanes that had nuclear weapons loaded. A few hours later, Bush lands there to give his speech. It was very surreal.
Oh my gosh, I forgot about that.
Yeah, and I listened to a speech where I could see the 8th Air Force building, but I was behind, the red line on the concrete. But I could see where he was giving a speech, and luckily the airman that was guarding our airplane had a speaker. We could listen to the speech, and then a few minutes later he drove by and everybody saluted him, and things changed.
So Bush is giving his speech while you're standing next to a nuclear-armed B-52.
Correct. That's exactly right. I and a number, probably 100-ish other crew members all over the ramp waiting. That
must have been surreal. Just incredible.
Yeah.
Going, I've got nuclear armed airplanes behind me and I'm watching the president on the day the towers fell.
Yeah. And actually this probably didn't come on the news much, but the way he got from Air Force One to the 8th Air Force building, which at the time, Global Strike wasn't there yet. So at the time, the 8th Air Force building and the 8th Air Force commander's office, General Keck, by the way, General Keck's office was the nicest office on base. So they drove him to General Keck's office and he said, I got it. Took over his office and had all the comms he needed in there. And General Keck sat on the other side of his desk, and watched Bush write his own speech. It was a very interesting account to hear from him. But yeah, it was, we were thinking we were going to disperse, actually. When they brought us, after we responded to the aircraft, they brought us back in. Not usually common, as you know, as an aviator and anybody else listening, that you see a 2-star general in a flight suit with a holster around his flight suit with a 9mm. That's just not something that I don't think I'd ever seen that. And it
gosh.
Yeah, he greeted us as we came back to the airplanes and he said, hey, and he gave a little impromptu speech and he said, we don't know what's going on exactly in the world, but I just realized, and so did the president, that there's 30 plus airplanes out here loaded with nuclear weapons. So Barksdale probably just became the next target, in addition to, DC, obviously the towers and everything else. So he said, to that point, we're getting you the F out of here. And we'll call you airborne on HF, or we'll figure out how to get a hold of you and tell you where to land. So yeah, that's how I ended up back on the ramp. As they called our crew number and we went out to the airplane. We're like, all right, we're going to take off. And I got a toothbrush and we'll just figure out where we're going. And could be North Carolina, any other locations around the country. We waited. And finally it was, about 100 degrees in the cockpit. And I and my, the guy sitting next to me were like, we're going to go wait outside on the ramp because nothing's happening. We don't have engines running. Everybody's radio silent. And the reason they were silent, Mark, it turns out nobody was answering us or telling us where to go because they had just gotten word that Air Force One was inbound. And that obviously became the number one priority.
Ramp freeze
completely. My radar navigator was an experienced patchwearer graduate major at the time, looks at me and he's like, do you see that airplane way in the distance? And this is like probably 11 in the morning now. And obviously, as you know, and every airline or airplane was already on the ground in the whole United States. And I look in the distance, I'm like, yep, I do see that. And, it's probably 10 miles away. And it turns out it was a 747. As it gets closer, we're all like, surely that's got to be the NAOC, the E4 coming in wherever they were. They're just going to land here. And it gets closer. And then next thing you know, 2 Vipers fly over. Actually, not blue rings around the missiles, but brown rings around the AIM-120. So I'm like, okay, definitely not the NAOC. So that was interesting.
I'd forgotten all about that, Chico, that he flew into Barksdale.
Yeah.
And you guys were in the middle of a nuclear exercise.
in the middle of and that's why now I've learned that's why they chose to have him land there. Cause as you know, and everybody that a lot of people on the podcast probably know that Barksdale had been locked down for 4 days. I mean, you have that many nukes moving around between the WESIP and the weapons storage facility and the airplanes. I mean, the base was completely whatever threat Con Delta was back then.
Yeah.
Down.
Yeah.
So send them to Barksdale. It's one of the most secure bases in the U.S. right now. They're in the middle of an exercise. So they did. And he actually drove from Air Force One to the 8th Air Force building, as I mentioned, in a Humvee. That's how they got him, because they don't have any they didn't have the time.
There's no limo. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no limos or no vehicles. They're not going to take him in a bread truck. They figured out, we'll just take him a Humvee. So he got in a Humvee, an up-armored Humvee, and rode from Air Force One to the 8th Air Force building right by us.
And Chico, people don't understand the logistics that has to happen when the president comes to your location. I mean, there's an ADVON team that comes in there, again, with the beast and all these different things. And on this day, he just showed up. Right. He's just showing up. How long did it take for you guys? You're going to deploy, because this is September, and October 7th, your B-52 guys are heading to Afghanistan. Oh, after 9/11, you only had a couple of weeks probably to prepare, didn't you?
Yeah. And it's funny you ask that, because tying it back to what you just mentioned, the whole day of 9/11, which obviously touched a lot of us in a different way. The interesting thing for me is I'd say I'd been combat mission ready for probably, 6, maybe almost a year, but still fairly, I'm still learning my craft. And so one of the senior guys who was mission commander qualified, et cetera, and my radar navigator at the time, now we're all Wizzos, he looks at me as we're going out. This is as we were responding to the aircraft at 9:12 in the morning. We did our pre-flight, got all the weapons ready to start engines. And hold on, don't start engines, because things had just changed. We did everything up to what we usually would keep doing. And everybody, the exercise coordinator, everybody came out and said, stop. He looks at us, and on interphone, he says, boys, looks like we're going to Diego Garcia. And that was I didn't even know where Diego Garcia was. I mean, but he had already been there a few times for Desert Fox and some other things. And he said he just knew, and he was right. To answer your question, they kept us on base for 5 days later, and we were already all there, Mark. So they just kept us in the Warrior facility, the alert check, and then a few days later they moved us to the actual hotel, which was nice, because underground facility, Louisiana, those don't usually go together. For
a whole host of reasons. Yeah.
They kept us on base, and finally they said, go home, kiss your wives, spouses, everything. And then that was around probably, I'm thinking now 15th-ish, and on September 21st, we left.
So September 21st, you're loading up the airplane, heading for Diego Garcia, and you have no idea when you're coming home.
Go to Diego. Yeah, true. Didn't know the duration. We were supposed to be, OPSEC, and at that time you couldn't tell your spouses and your families. And of course, in good bomber crew member fashion, guys are pulling up and getting scuba gear out of their cars. And I'm looking at my parents. My dad's so where are you going? I'm it's not in the mountains, I guess, but you can pretty much do. Really, you're putting there. You should have put them in a bag. But yeah, we went to Diego about 10 days later and waited a little while there. And then we finally, the OG and all the leadership was you guys got to do something. I mean, you can only drink so much Filipino beer waiting. A couple, we started doing CT missions around the island and just to stay ready. And luckily, the OG brought everybody in, who at that time actually was General Sebi. I'm not name dropping, but General Sebi Wilson was our 06 B1 OG. It was a consolidated B1 B-52 wing. He was our wing OG. 06 Colonel Wilson. And he's this, he identified the crews, and maybe it's because of my last name, but I was lucky to get chosen to be on the 4 ship of B-52s that kicked down the door on October 7th, which was a great honor.
Oh my gosh. Being picked for a mission like that, man, you feel like King Kong. I got chosen to lead a 3 ship of tankers refueling the first Weasel package into Baghdad for opening night of Desert Storm. Oh,
that's awesome. It was great. I mean, we had so much adrenaline, and we can talk about it now or later, but interestingly on that mission, we were about 2 minutes from turning around. I mean, the whole 4 ship, not bombing on October 7th. I mean, that's always the day we say that the war started. But a no-go criteria of ours was an SA-3. Surprisingly, they had an SA-3. I don't know if they knew how to operate it, but they had an SA-3 at Kandahar where their headquarters was. And no kidding, Mark, that thing was active out to we started seeing it a certain range. And they told it, they said, hey, at 50 miles, if you're still getting illumination, that's when you turn around, just to give us some pad, And at 60 miles, our E-dub's like, yep, I got signals. And we're like, man, I mean, to your point, we had, the taxiway at Diego, when we taxied out, Mark, 4 of us with JDAM on the wing, JDAM on the wings, 27 Mark 82s, 500 pounders in the bay times 4. So 12 JDAM, 2,000 pound JDAM on each airplane.
Oh, so man.
Yeah, we each had around, 40,000 pounds of bombs. I had never seen a taxiway like that. That was completely, there were people and trucks and fire trucks on each side of the taxiway, like standing and yelling certain explicatives, like go find Osama bin Laden. I'll put it in PG-13.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just surreal. The whole island was there watching us they let them go out, and they were like, it was crazy, and we were ready to go. And then to have to be about 2 minutes from turning around, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Like, we are ready. And this is why I'm a huge, huge fan of the Tomahawk. Tomahawk, they planned that down, for the element of surprise, down to the T, to where I got a chat message on my laptop, which was new technology then. And it said, hey, Tomahawk's inbound. And then next thing you know, our E-dub's like, I don't have any more. I don't have any signals. The SA-3 down. And I looked at my charts. I was a nav. I'm like, man, we are 55. We are 5 miles from 45 seconds from having to turn around. Next thing you know, the chat message says, continue on. And then over secure voice, it said green light. And we kept on going. And 4 minutes later, dropped a lot of weaponry.
A lot of weaponry. That's a lot of weaponry. So if I can ask, what was the target? Was it like an airfield or a group of buildings?
I have not. So interestingly, I've been to Kabul, but there's probably some guys and gals on that are going to listen to this that have been to Kandahar. I haven't been. I have heard from buddies that have been there that apparently the craters are still there. When you fly in on a helicopter, you see them. And that's I'm not saying that was October 7th, because we did 4 runs of, 12 JDAM each. So 48, 2,000 pounder. And then at about I think we were about a mile or two spacing. And then we came around, and just to, kind of clean it up, we each dropped 27 Mark 82s in one pass. 500 pounders. So to answer your quote, we had for the JDAM, we had multiple DEMPs. That was it was 2 a.m. That was their terrorist training. It was terrorist training camp headquarters, but they had, supply buildings, finance, lodging, all that. So yeah, we just leveled the whole facility.
Oh, man, that's a lot of tonnage, man.
Yeah, it is. I think they had, I think on with the 8 Mark 82s, I believe we just kind of dropped them a stick each on the runway, just in case they had something they wanted to use it for. So, and then
what was your conversation in the cockpit when you guys are coming home? What are you guys talking about when you're coming home? Yeah,
there's a lot. I'm, as you know, like with your crews, I'm still really close to all those guys. But yeah, it was a lot of adrenaline, listen to music. Nobody usually, after a while, we had combat missions where somebody would rotate naps, but I don't think anybody took a nap that night.
No, I don't think so. I know Sevy Wilson well. When we were standing up weapons school for the 135, he was the Bone Division commander, and we talked with him numerous times. Last time I saw him was at an AFA convention, and we got to talk for quite a while. A fantastic American.
Yeah, he is. It was great.
I think he finished as like the vice chief of staff of of the military. Super, super guy. He's a great leadership. He's one of those guys that you hope is in your leadership stack when you go somewhere. Right. So tell our listeners what it's like flying from Diego Garcia to the target area in Afghanistan. And you know what, Chico? I still remember the names of the refueling tracks, El Dorado and Durango.
Yeah, that's funny. You remember that. I think you and I talked about it recently, and probably you remember talking to Red Crown and all those guys on the driveways. No, it was fairly, I don't say mundane, but, it was a long, probably from what I recall, it was like a 6-hour drive up to actually get in country. And being in a B-52 and there's probably people have this experience. I mean, when you take off out of a tropical island and it's winter on the target area, you have to kind of plan ahead for that. So it turns out I did not wear my thermals going to my pre-takeoff briefing when it's 90 degrees in Diego Garcia. So you got some time to change, unlike a fighter guy or a gal, but what we did, you kind of prepare, plan, there's some good camaraderie, listen to some music, and then, how it goes, like 2 hours out. It's like everybody starts getting ready and changing, getting in the mental mindset and getting all your stuff ready to go and strapped in. And to your point, we always got, it depended, but I think most off memory, I think it was about 100,000. Does that sound right? About 80?
Yeah, 80,000 pounds every time.
Right. On the way up there, depending on how much we didn't drop, on the way home, how much we needed to get for gas. But we hit an AR on the way up and one on the way home. And for when I was there, it was mostly KC-10s for en route AR, but I did have a mission like around November-ish where we actually got AR from a 135 in Afghanistan. I mean, in country. And it was like, it wasn't briefed. It was, and that's a whole different subject. But the whole rendezvous it was just come over, secure voice and said, go meet this tanker at this time. And that's what we did. And whatever it is, hopefully it was already inside 30 minutes for the ARCT by the time they told us. So we immediately just got on the frequency and it was one of those where your training pays off. But as a new guy, what usually took half a day to coordinate and then call the tanker and chat about it and brief it. And we did it in probably 15 minutes. And they gave us gas because there was a target, an emergency target. And we were out of loiter time. So those guys were awesome. I mean, to be that early in the conflict, flying in country, I mean, it was awesome. So the missions were pretty benign. I mean, transit time was pretty benign, but as you get closer, it was key to really study. Because I know you and I have talked about this. After the first week or so was pre-planned targets, but really rapidly it got into, just emerging casts. So call these guys and they could be from Australia, the UK. I mean, who knows who you're going to talk to right on the ground. And that was a whole new TTP for us. So to answer your question is like, when we were going to do casts, there was a lot of studying time, and I'm thankful we had it because we hadn't trained to that. It wasn't a TTP that existed. I didn't know what a J-fire was. I'm sure a guy, that's the Bible, but I didn't have any of that. So I studied the heck out of my charts. I studied where I thought they were going to be, what they're going to be driving, what the potential target can be, all that. I was just trying to get smart on what this whole troop, close proximity was going to be. So
while you're in the air flying the mission.
Yes.
You're doing all this.
Yeah, exactly. Got to study and be ready. So I
find it fascinating, Chico.
Yeah.
That you guys didn't even have close air support in any of your doc. None of this stuff you'd done before, kind of like the F-15Es, because they had stiff armed the whole cast thing for so long. And now all of a sudden you're thrown into a mission that you haven't trained for at all. Yeah.
And I mean, it's just the way. In the early 2000s, I mean, we had planned we did accent training, dynamic targeting, early version of that. But all of that was geared towards if we went back to Iraq and if we got into the forward line of the troops and the FIBA and everything was very they'll be 15 miles away. You're going to bomb a few of these targets, maybe hit a convoy, but the friendlies will be 5-10 clicks away at least. So when you first hear of a target that is inside, a mile away, which sounds like now that's a good distance. Now that I've done it, I'm like, inside a mile, I got all kinds of room. But when you put something on your chart and you realize the guy is half a mile away, we had never trained for that, at least in our generation. I mean, and then actually when I went to instructor school, a lot of the instructors at the school asked me to, my paper, we want you to write a paper, brief us on close air support, because we haven't done it. They hadn't gone to, and they never trained for it. So it was just everybody was really good about collecting notes and TTPs to the point where we had our own handwritten, how it is. We had a 3-page in-flight guide, I think, called Close Air Support that had each page had like a half a page written by this guy, literally written. Another was written by this guy. And then we photocopied the shit out of it, stapled it together, and then made 20 copies and like, take that with you. Make sure that you have to sign off that you got that before you step to the jet. And that's how we did it. And we just kept updating it. It became almost like a FCIF, but it was how to do casts. And every time we heard something different or saw something different, we updated that because we didn't have a lot of time actually to talk at the bar, you know, how you can now. I mean, we weren't on it was such a 24/7 cycle. Never were we all together. And rarely did we have a time where we could there's just very busy. It was the first few months of the war. So that would have been nice. You know, I've had those. You've had those times where you can do a hangar. Everybody can hear it right then, and then you can update the in-flight guide. But this was evolving so fast that if you did have time to talk to somebody, you could file it and be like, man, I might see that tomorrow night. But everybody's great about sharing, and it was every mission somebody saw something different.
That's crazy. And so you guys had never dealt with 9 lines or any of that stuff prior to this?
Nothing. And you know, you and I talked about this, I think, a few weeks ago. As a experienced like instructor now, old guy basically, I still would tell when I was an FTU instructor, I would tell my students, I'm like, if you want to write down where you think the friendlies are, their position, which should only come to you in like cardinal direction and rough distance, that's okay to write it somewhere else. Never plug that into any sort of system or computer. And here's why. And I would tell them we were doing that in early 2000, October, November of 2001. We hadn't done casts, and I wanted to know where the friendly was in relation to the target. And sometimes I think I shared with you, they had a beacon. So we would roll the cursor over there's a procedure, but I could get their actual coordinates. And then I would have that in my system. And then I would have the target that he's getting ready to read me as part of the 9 line in the system. And once we started talking about it, we're like, you can never have the friendlies coordinates in the system. So, because an F-18 what I recall, there was a friendly fire incident. So we decided, those things were evolving, but to an A-10 or somebody had grown up doing casts, that was almost like boldface. Yeah. But for us, I just was thinking, so now as we learned, we're like, all right, cardinal direction, don't ever put it in the system. So I always made that part of my story when I talked to trained students on why not to put coordinates in the system.
You mentioned something during that conversation about beacons. Talk to us a little bit about how you dealt with that, because you mentioned, putting the cursor over this beacon and everything. And yeah, there must have been hundreds of beacons out there though.
Yeah, you're right. I guess we kind of got lucky, and unfortunately we had the B-52 had a mishap in Djibouti where same kind of thing. The friendlies, the guys on the ground, Marines, were using a beacon to identify their position or help identify their position, and which came in handy. We have the B-52 is getting a new update soon, but it's still a 1960s vintage ground mapping radar. So to tune that thing and, all the stuff that goes with radar to find a beacon versus like finding a power plant or a intersection, it's just it's more of a challenge. There's all kinds of error that's already built into that in your system just because you found this little beacon. But we had a TTP to find it. Hadn't been used. The way we used the beacon actually, Mark, interestingly, was with AR, with Rendezvous. When the 135 would turn on their beacon, and we could identify that way. So we said, we'll use that TTP, but we'll just go to ground mode instead of slant range. Like we look for a tanker, we'll just map the ground for it. Well, that's just a little different than looking for a tanker. But we figured it all out. And some guys were putting that beacon coordinates, into their systems so they could use it as a fixed point. And then we actually had a mishap where years later where the B-52 bombed the cursor location and the beacon instead of the target. So that TTP never happened again. And there's actually, warnings.
Oh, yeah.
But that was an accepted TTP because it allowed us to see very big picture very quickly where the target was in relation to the friendly. And not having grown up on casts, A-10 guys could probably just do all that in about 20 seconds in their brain, right? And have a common picture and have some technology. But we didn't have that. And but we learned, and it was a tough lesson. But you asked me, that was a lesson learned. What I took away from it is awesome how aircrew are great at like sharing lessons learned and learning from each other. And it's like thick skin, humility. It's not personal. And so I think everybody did an awesome job of trying to just share what we were experiencing.
See, isn't that amazing? The flexibility that air power gives to not only people on the ground, but to the guys that are flying the mission too. That is something we excel at. The American military, particularly the Air Force, excels at on-the-job training. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, unfortunately, we have to do on-the-job training, like you mentioned. That became like a living document, didn't it? Because over a period of time, you were adding stuff to it, probably even taking stuff away from it also. As you learned and as your learning curve started to grow, that document became solidified. You know what? And that's probably what you guys use now for close air support, and you guys solidified that. You guys started that.
Yeah, kind of. It's interesting you say that because my wing, so I was active duty then, but I joined the reserves in 2004. And at that time, the reserve wing in Barksdale was A-10s and B-52s in the same wing. So yeah. Attack wing, it was just a wing. We were the 917th wing because it had an attack mission and a bomber mission. And I remember after I went to weapons school, I was like, hey, how many, I called the A-10 weapons school, or the chief of weapons and tactics, who was in my same ops group, but we never did much of them because we had such different mission sets. And I called him like, hey, why are we not doing like a Friday afternoon? Let's get a couple kegs and talk about CAS. He's like, we'd love to talk to you guys about CAS. He's like, but we do CAS, the B-52 doesn't. And I'm like, actually, we're not doing CAS exactly like you guys, but we are doing, it's called CAS. So as we got and I got it, that's their bread and butter, but it was almost like a very friendly rivalry and discussion. And then as I got closer to that guy and we're still friends. We did that, Mark. We had some Friday sessions. We learned so much from those guys and it was amazing how we hadn't really shared much before. And they're talking about this thing called the J-Fire. I'm like, why do we only have one copy of the J-Fire per mission planning room? Every B-52 guy and gal should have a copy. So I went and ordered 300 copies of those things. I'm like, that's what it fits in your pocket. We need to study this thing. So it's just, I learned a lot from those guys. I think they learned some things from us. They're like, that's interesting. You can do CAS in the low 30s. I'm like, yeah, it turns out with the JDAM you can in a targeting pod. So it was very, that was a cool exchange. And to see two very different platforms and backgrounds come together, to your point, and share, it was awesome. It was a fun time putting a pod on the airplane.
So I want you to tell all our listeners about another tactics, techniques, and procedures in situation that you had doing hurricane relief. A B-52 during hurricane relief and humanitarian relief. You told me about this and I was dumbfounded when I heard this. Talk about that for a few minutes.
Yeah, just for the record, it's a lot more fun, right, to kill people and break things. But the next thing, but no, it was, so as I mentioned earlier, like the A-10 guys and other communities, within the fighter community especially, we put a targeting pod officially on the B-52 like around 2003, but it was still in the infant stages. The reserves were doing it. But then around 2007, actually, when I went to weapons school, was when the active duty fleet was starting to get its first order of sniper pod or lightning pods. At that point, pod employment on the B-52 was very nascent, and the weapons school, when I went through weapons school, the instructors actually had me kind of show them a little bit how to use the pod because it was so new, and we used it in the reserves because we can get things faster and cheaper. And it was just active duty was kind of a fast follower. But anyways, because in the reserves, we had this pod capability that we were using. I think it was 05-ish, 6 maybe. Hurricane Ike in Galveston, which wasn't that far from Shreveport. It hit the heck out of the town. It hit a bunch of oil rigs. And somehow, I don't know the genesis of it, but I think it was some of our weapons and tactics guys were leaning forward. And FEMA officially came into our wing and said, can you help us with this? And we said, technically we can't do, ISR, that whole thing, but we're happy to go out if you give us some points of interest. And so we did, Mark. I think we got AR and we went over the Gulf of Mexico, which is 45-minute flight or something from Shreveport, and went over the Gulf, and we had 20-ish points of interest, which were individual oil rigs having that kind of loiter time. And we just took the pod, slewed it to it, hit record. And we ended up having all the incident awareness assessment is what we had to call it. We took all that video, and when we landed, I remember there's FEMA met us at the airplane. We gave them our tape and said, here's the video of it. We don't know exactly. We haven't done this. Your job, but they said, great. That's what we needed. And it was a cool use, I think, of the airplane. They probably had access to helicopters, but we put that right into a training mission. It took an hour or two out of our whole mission. And then we did some maritime training with it anyways, maritime targeting as well, simulated. But it was in the pod. There's things we were learning we could do with the pod that when you have that kind of loiter time, I mean, we could look at borders. I mean, there's all kinds of things we were proposing we could do, or educating the rest of the fleet who's used to maybe like an F-15. I mean, nothing against, or someone that has this more tanker demands. And we're like, we got a pod, things we can do with it over, 6 to 8 hours. We can go stare at something if you want us to.
And see, that's an amazing thing I didn't know about. When you mentioned that to me, I went, no way. And then, but again, you think about it and you go, why not?
Yeah.
6 hour loiter time with a Lightning pod. And the Lightning has really good video, not as good as Sniper, and the other thing too, if I remember right, is you can data link that picture or that full motion video off the airplane to anybody that's on a net. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Now we can. The B-52 can. It's time as Rover was one of the capabilities that the guys on the ground, you could send it to them so they could help you look at something. Explain
to everybody what Rover is, because that is an incredible tool that, again,
yeah. They had
out of nothing.
Oh, yeah, it was great. I mean, it was allowed the ground guys to see your video while you're looking at something, which helps with a talk on like dramatically.
And it's got that John Madden tool thing in it too.
Yeah.
You can say, no, not here.
Yeah, that's pretty neat when they start drawing. That helps because at least when I was flying the B-52, I don't know if the video capability has changed yet, but there was no color. Everything was white hot or black hot. So when he's like, I got a red van, I'm looking at it, it's like, I think it's going to show up probably as black, depending on how light a red is it. And then when they just take the marker and circle, it's like, thank you. That's like 20 minutes that I just got back in my day. South first,
But again, you're talking to troops on the ground, some of them in contact, that your video is being downlinked to them so they can see what you're looking at, and they can tell you over the same net, no, not that house. This house is the one we're interested in. And all of a sudden, all of your sensors are now looking there too. That was an amazing tool. I know I've had F-14 bros that told me, yeah, we have this new thing called Rover. I can't remember what it stands for, remote operating vision enhancement receiver or something like that. And what a game changer that thing was.
Yeah, I think it'll be things, Mark, like when you and I, like as we get, more experienced in age, I think even now, if I went back and talked to some bomber, because the B-1 is the great employment of the pod as well. If I went and talked to them about how early on when we did talk-ons, it was what I was seeing and what the guy on the ground was seeing, but he had to say contact. I had to describe it. And then he had to look at it through his laser rangefinder or eyeballs and say, yes, that is that is contact. Now shift 50 meters from there. See that road? Go south 20 meters on that. See that wagon? Just to the east of that, there's a building. You got the building. Well, that could take 30 minutes plus because I'm describing it. Neither one of us is seeing the exact same thing because he couldn't see my pod and I couldn't see what his eyeballs were. And then to say, yes, that's your target. And then he reads the 9-line, bam, and he schwack it. I mean, nobody ever saw exact. We didn't have 100%. Now it's video and everybody's verifying together. If that makes sense. So yeah.
Hey, another question I wanted to ask you. I understand that there is a lot of planning that goes into you employing air-launched cruise missiles, and that takes some time. Can you talk to that for just a few minutes in general terms? Because that's one of the weapons that B-52s are known for carrying. And we've seen the conventional Tomahawks going into downtown Baghdad, even into Afghanistan and so forth. Talk about the Alchem mission for just a minute, as much as you can.
No, good question. And once I got to STRATCOM, I learned not as, tactically, it's more fun to be in the cockpit, but I learned a little more from this standpoint, like how much is involved. I had no idea how much planning it took. And even if we ever did employ that, how much discussion occurred at the presidential national level to then the air room actually working their software and hitting send. It's just amazing to when it actually got to where it was ready for, execution, I'll call it, on a bomber. There is significant planning, and at the tactical level, it's gotten better, but yeah, it's still a lot of planning, and there isn't flexibility built into it for the safe, secure reason. But it's there's a lot of different people that are involved, down to like the OSS, mission planning level, to get that put on a cartridge, I'll call it, to then go employ whatever weapon system it is. And then sometimes there is change that can occur. Sometimes there isn't, for, the nuclear reason.
Yeah.
But the JASM is a great weapon too. That's conventional, but it's got a great capability. That used to be very labor intensive. It's getting better as far as from a mission planning standpoint on the various platforms.
Yeah. And see, the B-1s just, during the Trump administration, used the JASM during those strikes in Syria. And, great I remember that research building just got flattened by JASM. My last job in the Air Force was at the Air Force's Operational Test and Evaluation Center. And the JASM was not doing well. They had 4 drops that did not go well. As a matter of fact, one of them missed by a whole bunch, to the point where it was heading off the range. And there was some GPS signal problems. And of course, Rockwell, being a GPS company, we're worried about that. But I remember JASM in its infancy was a great idea, but they were having a hard time bringing all that together. And then finally, I saw the B-1s that had employed them during those chemical weapons strikes in Syria. And it was amazing to see what those things could do. Yeah.
And I think, I don't want to totally misspeak, but my last information was that the B-1 could carry 24 of those. So I think 8 on each of their 3 racks. Full capability.
And, you mentioned maritime missions that you do. There's it's called LRASM, which is basically a sea maritime weapon for JASM, another version of it that can actually go hunt ships too. A really capable missile. Talk to us a little bit about the weapon school syllabus for B-52 pilots and NAVs. And again, their weapons school is at Barksdale. I mean, you were right there. But tell our listeners, when you go through the Air Force weapons schools in the B-52 division, here's kind of our syllabus and our course of study.
Yeah, I mean, it was a while ago. So I've kept up a little bit about what their syllabus. I think the big thing, I think the biggest, I say positive is, and I'm not from the current integration they do, is that there's a lot of, it is, as you remember, integration is key. Now they call it used to be ME.
Mission employment.
Yeah. It was, when I went through, I think it's still called ME, but now it's integration. And I think it's great because it really is, and there's a lot of different platforms that are there. There's a lot of different capabilities to include, I think Air and Space have their own
ICBM school now. There's an ICBM division,
which I think is great. Just because we need to integrate. And if we're going to go to the next fight, the near peer, whatever you want to call it, peer, that's what I call it.
Yeah.
Be integrated. So I think there's much more emphasis on being integrated. The flying skills is still an important portion of it because you got to be the best of your contemporaries. Certainly, at least when I went through, there's also just as much of an emphasis on the mission planning part of it and integrating. And I believe that as much as I prefer the flying part versus mission planning. There is and I was better at it, not that good at the mission planning part, but in-depth detailed mission planning is just going to be more relevant, I believe, especially as we go more. I work a little bit in my civilian job on, it's unmanned and having all these different unmanned platforms possibly integrating with manned platforms, like closely integrating. So I think they're at the tip of the spear, so to speak, looking at that, which is great.
In your syllabus, how does your syllabus start? Because obviously you've got the nuclear mission, you got the conventional mission, and the air-launched cruise missile mission. Obviously, you're dropping some of these weapons. You're employing some of these weapons as you're going through school. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think I think it's still a pretty similar construct, with a lot of academics at the beginning. Then the flying portion, you mentioned Barksdale, the B-1 weapons school, is it, I think of Dias. Yeah, I think they were at Rapid City at one time. Yeah, so they, but everybody, I think in the B-2s are Whiteman. There's a host of other platforms that, like Little Rock for the C-130. We still all get together out at, Nellis multiple times throughout a 6-month syllabus, which is good. And then it culminates in about your last month being there for integration and then the capstone exercises. Yeah. 60, 70 platforms, airborne at the same time. So it's a full fight. And now they're doing it, more geared towards potentially the Asia theater, which is great. And some of the limitations you might have with space, which I think is very important because, as you know, we rely very heavily on it. Yeah. So it's academics in the beginning. Then when I went through it, I think it's still this way, woven in with some flying in the middle, and then some papers, briefings to work on that capability as well that you have to have as a weapons officer to both teach your peers and also brief leadership.
What did you do your paper on?
My paper was mission planning with targeting pods. Targeting pod was still a new, I think I mentioned earlier, like a very new capability in the B-52. We were not accustomed to a lot of the tools that were out there to help you for better employment, to help you mission plan. We were kind of doing the antiquated, PFPS, Falcon View. Let's use those products however we can, drill down and maybe get some imagery and then have the crew go employ. And it's like when I'm talking to an Army guy on the ground who's describing a village and a road, Falcon View doesn't really help me out much. But there are some tools like gridded reference that I mentioned earlier, like the A-10 community was already using, Strike Eagles. So I was trying to leverage a lot of what they were doing. And by the way, like using a pod to mission plan, you can actually watch video beforehand. And so that was one of the themes of my paper was we got to be better at mission planning for it, because employing a pod in the 30s was a lot different than down in the 10,000 feet.
Yeah, a lot different. Yep. Chico, I remember preparing for the Shock and Awe campaign, began employing all these different assets in an ISR role, and they called it non-traditional ISR. And they had targets that we just didn't have any pictures of or any video of. And they would send Guard and Reserve F-16s that were deployed for Southern Watch, go look at this place, and this place, and take a lot of video, take a lot of pictures. They'd say to the Lantern F-14s, go to this place, take a lot of pictures. And we did this non-traditional ISR gathering for target folders that had never been done before. And I think that's what you're talking about here too, is you're going out and you're looking at platforms with your Lightning pod, videotaping them, looking them over, seeing if there's any damage to them, those kinds of things, and how that translated to this non-traditional ISR mission that we started doing before we went into Iraq for the second time. We were using tools that in ways that we had never done before. I mean, we'd had the Predators up, and the Predators had been firing at all kinds of things and looking at all kinds of things, but man, they're unbelievably slow. Whereas you can get to some place in 350 knots, and even in the 30s, your targeting pod, particularly now that you guys got Sniper, takes beautiful pictures, incredible video that you can data link back to anybody that's on the net. You could be on a ship, you could be in the kayak, you could be in the headquarters there at 8th Air Force and see all of this stuff, which is pretty amazing.
There was one other mission that Chico and I talked about, and unfortunately he had to run off for a meeting that just freaking amazed me when he told me this. The B-52 is now being employed by Southern Command in the drug war. And this is what they're doing. They're doing boat interdiction now. Of all things, this 60-year-old airplane is now being employed by the DEA to help them hunt drug traffickers. And what Chico told me is they've got these wonderful targeting pods that, of course, give heading, altitude, speed, all of these different things with this beautiful video picture that they can data link off of the aircraft. They can data link to anybody that's got one of those rover laptops or to some command net or node that is on their data link net. And he told me something really funny about this. He says, Mark, these drug guys in these boats are driving like crazy in these big cigarette boats, and now they see us in the contrails way up high. If you've seen a silhouette of a B-52 above 30,000 feet, it has a look and a signature all its own. You know it's a B-52 because you can see 8 contrails coming behind it, and it's got that very distinctive shape to it. When the drug guys see this, they start tossing the drugs overboard because they know they're either about to get captured or worse. The B-52, because it's got that targeting pod, can laze for GBU-12 laser-guided bombs, which are perfect for schwacking ships that are trying to get away. The GBU just goes to the laser dot, so it doesn't matter which direction, how fast those speedboats are going, they're not going to get away from this 500-pound bomb. But folks, I want you to think of this. This airplane, Eisenhower signed the check for it when he was president in the 1950s. And look at all the different things that this airplane is being used for now. And we've always said, you don't go to war with the army you want. You go to war with the army you have. One of the great lessons learned from being in the military. We have added things to the B-52 that has allowed it to remain relevant through its entire lifespan of 60 years. And now they're looking at, I think they've got it approved now too, they're going to re-engine the B-52. This airplane may fly into the 2050s, 2060s, and I want you to think about that, folks. This airplane may be 100 years old when we finally take it out of the inventory. I understand that the Northrop Grumman B-21 Raider is coming on board, and that's one of the airplanes that I got to work on when I was working at Collins Aerospace and actually helped write the white paper for the cockpit, which is another story in of itself because they asked us to make it manned or unmanned. They called it optionally manned. In other words, this new bomber, you can have people in it or maybe not have people in it. And I don't know because that thing went black world not too long after we wrote this white paper. But that airplane is going to replace the B-52, and the Stratofortress may be a 100-year-old bomber. Imagine that, man. 100 years old that these airplanes will be around. There are young men and women that are going to say, my grandfather or my great-grandfather flew this Boeing airplane back in the 60s or the 70s over Vietnam, in the 80s during the Reagan Cold War era, during the 90s over Iraq during Desert Storm, in the 2000 time frame during Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom. This has really been an incredible airplane, and we're going to keep it going for a while longer because we've got people like Chico Anderson and other weapons officers that have continued to say, hey, if we add this to this platform, we can make this relevant for a few more years. We can add more missions to it. And I mean, think about this, okay? Doing these drug interdiction missions, you've got a big, huge platform that can carry a lot of bombs. It's got a smart targeting pod on it, and it can hang out for 6 hours or longer with air refueling. It can stay up forever with air refueling, and they've done some of these long 20, 28-hour missions in the B-52s. So the Air Force has really gotten its money out of the B-52 bomber. And I really thank Chris Anderson, my good friend Chico, for coming on and letting us all take a look and a peek under the tent of what the B-52 bomber is doing now versus what it was doing in the 60s, flying Chrome Dome airborne alert missions with 4 nuclear bombs in it on these 24-hour missions into the Aegean Sea or into the North Pole region. and how far this airplane has come. During my series on Operation Anaconda, I interviewed Chief Warrant Officer Al Mack, and he mentioned that his book, Razor 3, A Night Stalker's Wars, was going to come out. Well, folks, it came out. I got mine in the mail this past week. I sat down in my easy chair at about 4:30 in the afternoon. At 9 o'clock, realized I'd gone through 3/4 of the book. It is that kind of book. I want all of you to go out and buy Al Mack's book, Razor 3. It is an incredible look at how the Night Stalkers do their business. I mean, from everything from planning to execution, the missions that they get involved with. And this is only a handful that Al could talk about. But he was involved in missions in Desert Storm, Iraqi Freedom, Afghanistan, as we know, the Battle of Roberts Ridge, the pickup of Marcus Luttrell in Operation Red Wings. All of these different missions you get a sense for. And the cool thing was, some of these missions he was talking about, I was involved with at the Air Operations Center. I remember watching a helicopter land next to this MC-130 Ditka 03 that crash landed on the side of a mountain. I didn't know that was Al in the helicopter that picked these guys up. And of course, we came in and dropped 2 500-pound laser-guided bombs. I'll never forget watching the bombs hit this MC-130 that had crashed on this hillside, and one of the wheels flying like 40, 50 feet through the air and sliding down this snow-covered mountain. But he mentions all this in his book. So please, folks, I recommend this very highly. Go out and buy a copy of Razor 3, A Night Stalker's Wars by Al Mack. A great book, great pictures, and he talks about some pretty emotional things, not only his personal life, but his professional life. You get a behind-the-scenes look at how the best helicopter unit on the planet operates, plans, and the missions they've been involved with. This episode of Lessons from the Cockpit with my good buddy Colonel Chris Anderson has been brought to you by the book Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit, found in all 4 formats on Amazon: hardback, softback, Kindle, and Audible. Please, folks, go out and grab a copy of this behind-the-scenes look, air refueling on a global scale and in 4 wars, with 32 pictures inside the book. Those of you that buy the electronic versions, Kindle and Audible, there is an extra file that comes with the pictures. So folks, please go out and buy Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit. That's how this show is supported. I know that you will enjoy seeing how the air refueling world also works. This and previous episodes of the Lessons from the Cockpit show are found on my website at markhasera.com. We're doing really good. This is episode number 44, and we're quickly approaching 15,000 downloads, which I think is pretty good. On our show next week, I had the opportunity to spend some time with a gentleman that is truly a subject matter expert on adversary tactics. Next week, we're going to talk to my good friend Z-Man, who flew with the 26th Aggressor Squadron out of the Philippines and then got picked up for the Red Eagles. He got to fly MiGs in the famous top secret Air Force Squadron based out of Area 51, flying MiG-21s and MiG-23s. Folks, thanks for tuning in this week, and we will talk to you again next week on the Lessons from the Cockpit show.